It wasn't the disease that broke us. It was the silence that settled between us long before the doctors ever gave it a name. My name is Grace Whitmore. I turned 62 this spring in Asheville, North Carolina, a place where the mountains seem to keep everyone's secrets. I used to think love could survive anything: time, distance, even indifference. But I learned that sometimes what destroys love isn't anger or betrayal. It's the slow erosion of attention, the way you stop looking up when they walk into the room, the way you start living parallel lives under the same roof. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far our stories travel, because I know I'm not the only one who's lived through love's quiet unraveling. David and I met when we were 23. He was studying architecture, and I was finishing my degree in art education. He was the sort of man who built things, not just houses, but moments. He'd sketch blueprints on napkins at coffee shops and say, "One day I'll build us something that lasts." And for a while, he did. We had a little yellow house with creaky floors and a backyard full of tulips. We raised 2 kids, both grown now, both living far away, chasing their own lives. But time doesn't knock before it takes things from you. It starts small, a forgotten anniversary, a dinner eaten in silence. Then one morning, you wake up beside someone you've loved half your life and realize you don't really know them anymore. That's how it was for us. The laughter disappeared first, then the long talks at night, the gentle teasing. Even our arguments lost heat. What remained was quiet. Thick, heavy quiet. I'd spend my evenings painting in the small studio behind our house. The smell of turpentine and acrylic became my companions. David would stay inside, watching television or scrolling through old architectural magazines, not really seeing the pages. We passed each other like ghosts, neither of us brave enough to say we were lonely. Sometimes I told myself this was just what marriage looked like after decades together. Comfortable silence, predictable routines, the kind of companionship that doesn't ask for much. But deep down, I knew it wasn't comfort. It was distance, wearing a disguise. The day I realized how far we'd drifted was so ordinary it almost went unnoticed. It was a Sunday. I was making coffee, and David came into the kitchen. He brushed past me, grabbed a mug, and sat at the table without a word. I looked at him, really looked at him, and it struck me. I couldn't remember the last time he'd touched me. Not a hand on my shoulder, not a kiss goodnight. It had been more than a year. I felt like a stranger standing in my own home. That night, lying awake, I asked myself a question that scared me. If I disappeared tomorrow, would he notice right away? The answer hurt more than I expected. Still, I stayed. Partly because leaving felt like betrayal. Partly because I kept hoping something would change. But mostly because habit can feel a lot like love, when you've forgotten what love used to feel like. I thought that was the end of our story, the quiet fade out after decades together. But I was wrong. The truth was waiting, patient and cruel, just around the corner. Because a few months later, the forgetting began. Not between us this time, but inside him. When people talk about losing someone, they usually mean death. But there's another kind of loss that's harder to explain. The kind that happens while the person is still sitting right next to you. Even before the doctors mentioned Alzheimer's, the signs were there, buried inside the daily rhythm of our lives. I just didn't want to see them. The distance between David and me had become so normal that forgetting felt like part of the routine. When he misplaced his keys, I assumed he was distracted. When he called our daughter by the wrong name, I laughed it off. But deep down, something in me stirred. a quiet, growing fear I didn't dare name. There was a time when our home was alive with sound. The radio in the kitchen, David humming while fixing something in the garage, my laughter bouncing off the walls. But now, silence ruled every room. We still ate dinner together, though it felt more like an obligation than a ritual. I'd ask about his day. He'd answer with a few flat words. The man who once told stories with spark in his eyes now spoke as if language itself had grown heavy. I began spending more time in my studio. The act of painting became both escape and confession. Each stroke of color was a word I couldn't say out loud. I painted women standing at the edge of things, cliffs, oceans, doors they were afraid to open. Women like me. Sometimes, late at night, I'd hear him talking in his sleep. Soft, jumbled phrases that didn't make sense. "Don't forget the beans," he'd murmur. "The blueprints are in the drawer." Even in dreams, he was building something. But what he was constructing now, I couldn't see. The loneliness became a third presence in the house, an invisible guest sitting at our table. I'd catch glimpses of old photos on the wall, of our younger faces smiling back at me. And I'd wonder how people change without meaning to, how love can lose its color even when both hearts are still beating. Once I almost left. I packed a small bag. Nothing dramatic, just the essentials. I even got as far as the front porch before the guilt stopped me cold. Leaving felt like turning my back on a promise I'd made decades earlier. For better or for worse. But no one ever tells you that worse can look like years of quiet disconnection, not just sickness or grief. Then came the night that burned itself into my memory. A storm had rolled in, loud and restless. The power went out, and the house was drenched in darkness. I found David sitting in the living room, staring at nothing. Lightning flashed, and I saw tears on his face. He didn't even seem to notice me standing there. It was the first time I'd seen him cry in years. I wanted to reach out, to ask what was wrong, but I didn't. The distance between us wasn't measured in steps anymore. It was measured in courage, and I didn't have enough that night. The next morning, everything was normal again, or at least the version of normal we had become used to. Coffee, silence, routine. But something in me shifted. I couldn't stop thinking about the look in his eyes during that storm, like he was lost in a place I couldn't follow. Days later, when I asked him to drive to the store for milk, he came back with bread and forgot where he'd parked. He laughed it off, embarrassed, and I joined him. But that night, I sat at the kitchen table long after he'd gone to bed, tracing circles on the wood with my finger, whispering to no one, "Something's wrong." What I didn't know then was that those small, strange moments, the misplaced car, the forgotten words, the confusion in his eyes, were the opening notes of a song that would rewrite our lives. I used to think forgetting was the cruelest thing that could happen to love. But I was about to learn that sometimes losing the past is the only way to find your way back to the heart of it. The morning it became undeniable began like any other. Soft light through the curtains, the kettle whistling, and David sitting at the table, staring at a newspaper he wasn't really reading. I asked if he wanted eggs, and he said, "Maybe tomorrow." It wasn't the words that frightened me. It was the way he said them, quiet and uncertain, as if he wasn't sure what day it was, or if tomorrow would ever come. Later that week, we went to the grocery store together. He wandered off in the cereal aisle, and when I found him, he looked at me blankly. For a full minute, there was no recognition, just confusion flickering across his face. Then, like a light, slow moment, cracked something open in me. The fear I'd buried deep started seeping out, unstoppable. I drove us home in silence, my hands gripping the wheel until my knuckles went white. I made an appointment with a neurologist the following week. The waiting room smelled like disinfectant and coffee that had been sitting too long. David fidgeted beside me, tapping his knee the way he used to when he was nervous about a job interview. I told myself it was probably nothing. Stress, maybe mild forgetfulness. But part of me knew the truth long before the doctor said the word Alzheimer's. It hung in the air like a sentence neither of us deserved. I watched David's face as the doctor explained the stages, the symptoms, the slow unraveling of memory that would follow. David nodded, polite and distant, like he was listening to someone else's story. I sat frozen, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. When we got home, he went straight to the back porch and sat there for hours. The mountains stretched out in front of him, blue and endless. I stood in the doorway, not knowing whether to hold him or leave him alone. Eventually, I sat beside him, and we didn't say a word. The silence wasn't empty this time. It was heavy with everything we couldn't bring ourselves to say. That night, he turned to me in bed and whispered, "Promise me you won't let me forget who I am." I wanted to promise. I really did. But I couldn't lie. So instead, I said, "I'll remind you every day." The days that followed blurred together. Doctor visits, memory tests, pamphlets filled with words like progressive and degenerative. Friends stopped by with casseroles and cautious smiles, the kind people wear when they don't know what to say. Our children called often, their voices trembling between hope and fear. I pretended to be strong for all of them, but when the house was quiet, I'd go to my studio and cry until I couldn't see the canvas in front of me. One evening, while sorting through old photos, David picked up a picture of our wedding. His thumb brushed over my face, and he smiled faintly. "She looks happy," he said. I waited, breath held to see if he'd realize it was me. A long pause. Then, softly, he added, "You look just like her." I don't remember the rest of that night, only that I went to bed with a strange calm, as if the fear had turned into something else. Maybe acceptance. Maybe something close to love again. In the weeks that followed, I began to notice small changes. He forgot to lock doors. He asked the same questions twice. But in between the forgetting, something unexpected began to bloom: gentleness. The coldness that had built up between us began to melt. He'd reach for my hand when we watched TV. He'd call me darlin' again, a name I hadn't heard in years. It wasn't consistent. Some days he'd retreat into confusion, and I'd be a stranger again. But when he looked at me and smiled, it felt like sunlight breaking through fog. I realized then that maybe the man I'd lost long before Alzheimer's wasn't gone forever. Maybe, in the strangest twist of fate, this illness was giving us back what time had stolen. But I also knew the hardest part hadn't come yet, because love, when tested by forgetting, becomes something both fragile and fierce. A memory you fight to keep alive even as it slips away. The shift didn't happen all at once. It was slow, so slow that I almost missed it at first. But one morning, as I was pouring coffee, I heard humming from the living room. David was standing by the window, sunlight on his face, humming the same tune he used to whistle while building our first house. It had been decades since I'd heard that sound. When he turned and saw me, he smiled. "Morning, sweetheart," he said. The word hit me like a soft blow. I hadn't been called that in years. From that day on, small moments of the man I once knew began to return. He followed me around the kitchen, asking questions about my paintings. Sometimes he'd pause halfway through a sentence, lost in thought. But when his eyes met mine, I saw recognition. Not of the present, but of something deeper. I started reading to him at night. Old poetry he used to love, stories about places we'd never been. He'd listen quietly, sometimes repeating the last line under his breath. Once, he took my hand and said, "I remember this sound, your voice. It makes everything feel safe." I turned away so he wouldn't see the tears. Caring for him became my new rhythm. I organized pills, labeled drawers, wrote reminders on sticky notes. But it didn't feel like duty. It felt like devotion, like I was finally learning to love him in a way that wasn't built on expectation or resentment. Some days, he'd forget simple things. My name, the year, where he was. But he never forgot how to look at me with that same warmth I'd been missing for so long. One evening, as I was cooking dinner, he shuffled into the kitchen and started humming again. He reached out his hand. "Dance with me," he said. I laughed. It had been so long since either of us danced. But he was already pulling me close. The world outside faded. His steps were clumsy, but his arms were steady, and in that moment, it felt like time folded in on itself. We weren't 60 anymore. We were 23 again, spinning in the glow of our first love. He began calling me his girl again, sometimes mixing me up with memories of his younger days. Once he asked if I'd marry him. I told him we already had, years ago. He smiled, confused, but happy. "Then I must be the luckiest man alive," he said. It wasn't the kind of romance you read about in novels. It was quieter, smaller, but real. There were moments of frustration, too. He'd wander off in the yard, searching for something that didn't exist. He'd ask about his parents, long gone, and I'd have to find gentle ways to remind him. Each correction felt like a tiny heartbreak. But even through the confusion, there was tenderness. Sometimes he'd sit beside me and just hold my hand, tracing the lines on my palm as if memorizing them. "I know these hands," he'd whisper. "They've always been good to me." At night, I'd lie awake listening to his breathing, and I'd think about how strange love is, how it can fade and return, break and heal, die and still find a way to live again. Alzheimer's was taking him piece by piece, but in its strange, cruel mercy, it had given me back the man I thought I'd lost forever. One morning, while I was making the bed, he said, "You're the best part of my story." He didn't know I'd been recording his words in a little notebook, afraid I'd forget them someday too. I smiled and told him, "You're the best part of mine." That night, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky, I realized something had shifted inside me too. The resentment that once lived in my chest was gone. In its place was something softer, acceptance, maybe even gratitude. Because love, I learned, isn't about remembering everything. It's about being present in the moments that still exist. And in those moments, however fleeting, David had found me again. The rhythm of our days began to change in ways that were both gentle and startling. I had spent so many years aching for a version of love that felt alive again, and now, in this strange second act of our marriage, life was giving it back in fragments. It wasn't the kind of love that swept you off your feet. It was quieter, softer, woven into gestures, looks, and echoes of the past that Alzheimer's couldn't quite erase. One morning, as I prepared breakfast, I heard laughter from the living room. David was sitting on the floor, surrounded by my old art supplies, holding a paintbrush like it was something precious. "Thought I'd make you a masterpiece," he said, his grin crooked, boyish. His hands trembled slightly as he painted, and the result was a mess of color, clumsy strokes of blue and gold. But when he looked up at me, eyes wide and proud, I saw the man who used to paint the future in dreams. I started painting with him after that. We'd sit side by side in the afternoon light, brushes dipping into paint. Silence between us, filled with something that felt almost... He'd ask questions he already knew the answers to. "What's your favorite color again?" And I'd tell him every time as if it were the first. "Turquoise," I'd say, and he'd smile like I'd shared a secret. Those were our new conversations, painted in repetition and tenderness. Evenings became our sanctuary. I'd play the old record player, the same songs we danced to when we were young. Sometimes he'd hum along, and sometimes he'd stand, take my hand, and lead me slowly around the living room. His steps weren't steady, but his eyes never left mine. One night, halfway through a song, he whispered, "You're the love of my life." I didn't correct him, didn't tell him he'd already said it 100 times before. I just nodded and whispered back, "And you're mine." There were still hard days. The forgetting didn't pause just because love had returned. Some mornings, he'd wake up disoriented, unsure where he was. He'd call out for his mother or ask when the children were coming home. But even in those moments of confusion, he'd search for me. "Where's Grace?" he'd ask over and over, and when I came into the room, his face would soften. "There you are," he'd say, relieved. "I knew I'd find you." I realized then that love had moved to a deeper place, beyond memory, beyond logic. It lived in instinct, in the part of him that recognized safety, even when names and faces blurred. One afternoon, while sitting on the porch, he began to tell me a story about a girl he once loved. I listened quietly as he described me in vivid detail, the way I used to wear my hair, the sound of my laugh, how I'd bite my lip when I was nervous. He didn't know he was talking about me, but I didn't interrupt. I let him speak. And as he finished, he looked out at the horizon and said softly, "I hope she knows how much I loved her." Tears filled my eyes. "She does," I whispered. That night, I wrote those words on a slip of paper and tucked them into my journal. "She does." It became my anchor for the days when the forgetting grew worse. Sometimes, during his clearer moments, he'd apologize. "I'm sorry for the years I was distant," he'd say, his voice trembling. "I don't know what happened to me." And I'd tell him the truth, that love isn't measured by years of perfection, but by the moments we choose to show up again. "You came back to me," I'd say. "That's what matters." The greatest gift Alzheimer's gave us, if you can call it that, was the return of intimacy stripped of pride. We no longer argued about who was right. We no longer held grudges. Every day was a clean slate. Every "I love you" was brand new. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, he turned to me and said, "If I forget you tomorrow, will you still come find me?" I smiled through tears. Every time, I told him. Every single time. And in that moment, surrounded by the fading light and the scent of rain in the air, I realized something I'd never known before. Love doesn't have to be remembered to be real. Sometimes it's strongest in the very act of being rediscovered. The decline crept in quietly, like a tide rising while you're standing still. At first, it was just small slips, a word lost here, a misplaced shoe, a name hovering at the edge of his tongue. But then, the spaces between clarity grew longer, and the fog stayed thicker. It was like watching a slow eclipse, the light of who he was dimming day by day. I tried to stay ahead of it. I read books about caregiving, labeled everything in the house, kept routines strict and steady. But no amount of preparation could soften the ache of watching him fade. The man who once built houses with precision and pride could no longer remember how to hold a spoon. The architect who once sketched dreams on napkins now stared at walls, lost in thought he couldn't reach. Yet, amid the heartbreak, moments of grace still appeared. One morning, he forgot my name completely. He looked at me with wide, frightened eyes and whispered, "I don't know who you are, but I know you're kind." I took his hand and smiled. "That's enough," I told him. "That's love." The house grew quieter, but not empty. The silence had changed. It wasn't the heavy silence from before, the one born of disconnection. This was gentler, tender, a silence that held presence instead of absence. Sometimes, I'd sit by his bedside, reading aloud, and he'd close his eyes and hum softly, as if he were following a melody only he could hear. There were hard days too, the kind that left me crying in the laundry room so he wouldn't see. Days when he grew agitated, angry at the world, angry at himself. "I'm broken," he'd say, pounding his fists against the chair. "I can't find my way home." And I'd kneel beside him, my hands on his knees, whispering, "You are home. You're right here with me." Sometimes it calmed him, sometimes it didn't. But I said it anyway, because it was the only truth I had left to give. I started noticing he spoke less, but his gestures spoke for him. A soft touch on my arm. The way he'd look at me when I walked into the room, eyes full of wordless trust. Once, as I tucked him into bed, he reached out, brushed my cheek, and said, "You're safe here." It took me a moment to understand. He wasn't reassuring himself. He was comforting me. Even in his unraveling, some instinct in him still wanted to protect me. I think that was the moment I stopped fighting the inevitable. Alzheimer's wasn't something to win against. It was something to walk through, hand in hand, for as long as we could. Love had changed shape again, from passion to companionship, from memory to presence, from recognition to faith. As the weeks passed, his world shrank. He stopped recognizing the house he built, stopped understanding the seasons outside. But he still smiled when I read to him, still hummed when I played the old records. The disease took so much, but it couldn't touch that small spark inside, the one that reached for connection even in the dark. One evening, I found him by the window, staring out at the sunset. "It's beautiful," he murmured. "Do you think she can see it too?" I didn't know who he meant by she. Maybe me? Maybe the memory of me. Maybe someone from another chapter of his life. But I stood beside him and said, "Yes, she sees it." Because in a way, I did. I learned that love doesn't always need to be returned to matter. Sometimes it just needs to be given freely, again and again, even when the other person can't give it back. And though I knew the worst was still to come, I also knew this. We had found our way back to each other once. Even if he forgot again, I'd remember for both of us. Because that's what love becomes in the end. A promise that outlasts memory. The day the nurse quietly suggested hospice, I nodded before she could finish the sentence. Somewhere deep inside, I'd been expecting it. The decline had reached a place words could no longer follow. David slept more than he woke. He no longer asked questions. He no longer tried to fill the quiet. And yet, even in that stillness, there was a kind of peace that felt almost sacred. We brought the hospital bed into the living room, near the window that looked out onto the maple trees he'd planted years ago. I filled the space with the things he loved, his sketches, old photographs, the lamp he'd built for me on our 5th anniversary. There was always music playing softly, the kind he used to hum along to while fixing things around the house. The scent of lavender drifted through the room, calming both of us. I learned to measure time differently then, not by days or hours, but by the small mercies that came between them. A clear sentence, a smile, the squeeze of a hand that still knew how to hold mine. He no longer said my name, but when I entered the room, his eyes always found me. That was enough. Recognition had become something more primal, something wordless and pure. I kept talking to him even when he couldn't respond. I told him stories from our life. The road trips, the Christmases when the kids were little, the years we thought love had run out, but somehow it hadn't. Sometimes I'd catch a flicker of emotion on his face, a hint of a smile, a quiet tear, and I'd imagine he was hearing every word, even if he couldn't show it. One evening, the sky outside turned the same golden hue as the tulips he'd planted long ago. I sat beside his bed, reading from a worn book of poems he once loved. My voice trembled, but I kept going. As I read, his fingers moved slightly, brushing against mine. Then, for the first time in weeks, he spoke. Barely a whisper. Grace. Just my name. But it was enough to fill the room with warmth. I leaned in close, tears falling onto his hand. I'm here, I whispered. I've always been here. He looked at me then, not with confusion or fear, but with a clarity I hadn't seen in months. You stayed, he murmured, and I nodded, unable to speak. I never left, I finally managed. Not once. That night, after the nurses left, I sat beside him until the house grew quiet. The clock ticked softly. The only light came from the lamp he'd built so many years ago. I watched his chest rise and fall, slow and steady, until even that rhythm began to falter. I took his hand and began humming the tune he used to hum, the one from our wedding dance, when everything felt new and endless. When the stillness came, it wasn't sudden. It was like a breath that simply decided not to return. I felt the weight of it, heavy and gentle all at once. For a long moment, I didn't move. I just sat there, his hand still in mine, the silence settling over us like snow. There's a kind of quiet that feels final, but not cruel. That's what it was. A closing of a door you knew couldn't stay open forever. I whispered into the air, "You can rest now. You found your way home." The morning after, the light came through the window just as it always had. The world didn't stop, even though mine had. I made coffee, fed the cat, opened the curtains. Life, I realized, keeps going, whether you're ready or not. When our children arrived, we went through his things together. In an old wooden box, I found his notebooks, pages filled with sketches, lists, small notes. On one torn page, in his uneven handwriting, were the words, "She stayed." That's all I need to remember. I pressed it to my chest and wept. His funeral was simple, just like he would have wanted. The pastor spoke about memory and faith, but I barely heard. What I remember is the wind moving through the trees, the sound of our daughter crying softly, and the feeling of his wedding ring heavy in my palm. That night, I sat on the porch, wrapped in one of his old sweaters. The stars were sharp and cold above the mountains. I closed my eyes and whispered into the dark. You found me once, even through forgetting. Find me again when it's my turn. And though I didn't hear an answer, I felt something. A stillness that wasn't empty, but full. The kind of silence that holds love, even after the last goodbye. In the months that followed, the house felt both too big and too full. Every corner whispered his name. The smell of his cologne lingered in the hallway. His handwriting still clung to the labels on the drawers. Grief isn't a single wave. It's an ocean, endless and unpredictable. Some days I felt strong enough to swim. Other days, I drowned quietly beneath its surface. But grief, like love, has its own strange way of reshaping you. I began painting again, not out of distraction, but out of need. My first canvas after his passing was titled "Remembering Us." I painted two figures standing in a field of color that shifted between clarity and blur, like memory itself. I filled the walls of my studio with new work, each piece a conversation between what I'd lost and what I'd found. Word spread. People started visiting, asking about the story behind the paintings. I told them the truth. That love doesn't end when memory does. It simply changes form. He forgot the world, I'd say. But he remembered how to love. And they'd nod, sometimes crying, sometimes smiling, because somehow everyone understood. The more I painted, the more I healed. The grief softened into something almost luminous, a quiet gratitude for the life we'd shared. I began volunteering at a local memory care center, teaching art to patients in the early stages of Alzheimer's. Every class reminded me of him. The patience required, the moments of joy that appeared out of nowhere, the laughter that bubbled up even in confusion. I'd guide trembling hands to the canvas and tell them what I'd learned. You don't have to remember every detail to feel something real. Sometimes I'd meet spouses sitting silently in the hallway, holding on to hope and heartbreak at once. I'd sit beside them and share my story, not as a tale of tragedy, but of transformation. The love doesn't disappear, I'd tell them. It just changes its language. You'll learn to speak it again. Seasons passed. The maple trees outside turned from green to gold to bare, then bloomed again. I found comfort in their rhythm, reminders that even after loss, life keeps renewing itself in quiet ways. One afternoon, while preparing for an art exhibit, I found that old piece of paper, the one with his handwriting. She stayed. I framed it and placed it beside a portrait I'd painted of us dancing. The gallery owner asked if it was for sale. I smiled and said, "No, that one belongs to me." The exhibit opened on a cold November evening. Strangers stood before my paintings, silent, moved. When I looked at their faces, I realized something profound. My pain had become connection. My story, once private and raw, had become a bridge between hearts. What began as loss had become light. That night, standing beneath the soft glow of the gallery lights, I whispered a quiet thank you to David, to the years, to the lessons that came wrapped in heartbreak. Because love, I'd learned, isn't measured by how long it lasts, but by how deeply it transforms us. N had become connection. My story, once private and raw, had become a bridge between hearts. What began as loss had become light. Now, when I walk through our house, I no longer feel haunted. I feel accompanied. His presence is everywhere, not as a shadow, but as warmth. Sometimes, when I pass by his chair or look out at the trees, I still talk to him. I kept my promise, I'll say softly. I remembered for both of us. People often ask how I survived it all. I tell them I didn't just survive, I grew. Because when love endures through forgetting, it becomes something purer, quieter, indestructible. It becomes faith. And if you're listening to this, wherever you are, maybe you've known that kind of love too. The kind that tests you, breaks you, remakes you. The kind that teaches you that strength isn't loud. It's steady. It's the choice to stay, to care, to remember when someone else can't. His story, our story, reminds me that even when everything else fades, love remains. Always. So before you go, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far our stories travel. And maybe, just maybe, someone out there will hear this and find comfort in knowing that even when memory falters, love never does. Just holy.